We're on slide number 8, the manuscript order of the Holy Scripture. Now, I want to start right from the very beginning to say that some of this presentation today will be from a Jewish perspective, and some of it will be from a Christian perspective. But it will all cover the Bible from Genesis through Revelation. So if you're used to talking about the Tanakh, we're going to be talking about the Tanakh. And if you're used to be talking about the Old Testament and the New Testament, we're going to be talking about that as well. So first of all, let me go to a scripture in Matthew, which many of you are familiar with. And it's in chapter 5, where Jesus says, "Do not suppose that I have come to weaken the law or the prophets. I have not come to weaken, but to fulfill." And this is in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. Jesus makes it very clear he's not come to weaken the law, the Torah, or the prophets, the Navim. And you could also say that this refers to the Tanakh, which means Torah, Navim, and Ketuvim, the law of the prophets and the writings. And in verse 18 he says, "For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not even a yod, which is the smallest letter in the Hebrew and Aramaic alphabet, or a dash shall pass from the law until all of it is fulfilled. Whoever therefore tries to weaken even one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But let anyone who observes and teaches them shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven." So Jesus is making it very clear that he did not come to overrule, to supersede, or to weaken the law and the prophets. He did not come to in any way do that. Yet, we have many people in Christianity in particular who say the Old Testament is done away with, it's been replaced by the New Testament. We call this supersessionism or replacement theology, and it conflicts with Jesus' own words. So that's very important to understand that Jesus did not come to weaken the Torah. He also did not come to keep the Torah exactly the way many of his successors keep it today. For example, we have some highly legalized fundamentalist type congregations that go above and beyond anything Jesus said about keeping the Torah. And we also have Orthodox Jewish congregations, shuls and synagogues, who say Jesus didn't even keep the Torah because he didn't keep it the way they keep it. Well, in the first century, there were various opinions on how the Torah should be kept, just as there is today. That's why we have so many different denominations. That's why we have, even in Judaism, we have the Orthodox, we have the Conservative, we have the Reform, we have a variety of other forms of Judaism. At the time of Jesus, there were about 17 different sects of Judaism. Today we have numerous, thousands of denominations in Christianity, every one of them thinking that they know the way to keep the law of God. So, first of all, let's get that right out of the way. My presentations are designed for everyone, whether you're very conservative or you're very liberal or somewhere in between. Anyone can benefit from this. So the first thing we need to understand is Tanakh. Tanakh is the Torah, the law, the Navim, prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings. And in Judaism, they are not all looked at the same level. For example, you don't look at the writings the same way you do the Torah. The first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, with their Greek names, are not to be looked at the same way you look at, for example, Proverbs or Psalms or even the prophets. The Torah is the highest because it was direct revelation from God to Moses to the people of Israel. So Torah is looked at with the highest regard in all of the scriptures. In the same way, and this is little known today, in Christianity, those of you that are familiar with traditional churches, such as the Roman Catholic Church or offshoots from the Roman Catholic Church, I know if you come from the Eastern Orthodox, you think you're first. The Roman Catholics think they're first. Neither one of you were first. Jesus and his disciples were first. But in any event, you have a tradition that when the gospel is read, everyone stands in the congregation out of respect for the words of Jesus. But when the epistles are read, everyone sits down. So there's a higher respect for the gospels than there are for the epistles, especially the epistles of Paul. However, when it comes to preaching and teaching, Paul is preached and taught many, many times over the words of Jesus. For example, if you ask the average evangelical Christian what their favorite books are, they'll probably say Romans or Ephesians. Very few are going to say James. The only ones that are going to say James are people who were in a church or a school where the books of the Bible were emphasized in their proper perspective. So we're going to talk about that. So number one, Tanakh. There's no such thing really as an Old Testament. It is Tanakh. Jesus would never have referred to it as an Old Testament. He referred to it as the Law and the Prophets. Then you have a term that's used primarily in Messianic Judaism called Brit Hadashah, which is the New Covenant. That term is somewhat misleading because the New Covenant is not about Christianity per se. The New Covenant is about writing the commandments of God in the heart. And that's what the New Covenant is, whether it's a Jewish heart or whether it's a Christian heart or even, dare I say, a Muslim heart. If it's one of the Abrahamic religions and the commandments of God are written inside to the point where the intention of that individual is to do the will of God and to fulfill the reason for which God created him or her, then that is New Covenant. It's not just written on tablets of stone, it's written on a fleshy heart. And it's in the heart and soul of that individual to do God's will. In Galatians, we have a very important text when it comes to the manuscript order of the scriptures. Let's look at Galatians chapter 2, and I'm reading verse 9 from the Lamsa translation from the Aramaic, but it'll read similar to this in your Greek Bibles or the English translations from the Greek. And when they knew that the grace had been given to me, then James, Kepha, or Peter, and John, who were considered to be pillars, very important phrase, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we might labor among the Gentiles, and they among the people of the circumcision. This is a very, very important verse. What this says is that Paul is subordinate not only to Jesus, but Paul is subordinate to Yaakov, James. You'll see that in Acts chapter 15. And Kepha, Peter, and to Johanan, John, because they are the pillars of the congregation that followed Jesus, or Yeshua in Aramaic, in Jerusalem and throughout Judea and Galilee. And their job in that area was primarily focused on Jews, whereas Paul's job was focused on Gentiles. Very important. Paul did not go out to tell everybody that the gospel replaced Judaism. Paul went out to reach the Gentiles. And then also in other areas, Paul went to Asia Minor. You know the churches that he went to. He wrote to them. He wrote to Philippi, to Corinth, to Thessalonica, to Galatia, and to other areas in Asia Minor. But Matthew went into Lebanon. Thomas went all the way as far as India. And Peter, at one point, even went into Babylon. So this is important. The priority here Even above John and Peter is James. This is vitally important. So, and when we read the scriptures, we really should start with the Gospels or the Torah, if we're going into the Tanakh, and then work out, if you're in the Tanakh, to the prophets, and then the Ketuvim. Or you could read various sections of the prophets and the writings along with Torah, but Torah should always be your core. In the same fashion, the Gospels should be the core for the Christian or the Noahide who is following the writings of Jesus, or even for a Jew, Messianic Jew or otherwise, who is reading what we call the New Testament, but which is more appropriately called the Gospels and the Epistles, and the book of Acts and Revelation. The Gospels would be first, then would come who? James. Then would come who? Peter. Then would come John. And then finally, after that, would be the other writings. Now, I have authorities for this. One is Friedrich Schreibner in his book, Introduction to Textual Criticism of the New Testament. E.W. Bullinger in his companion Bible, Appendix 95. McClintock and Strong in the Encyclopedia of Biblical, Theological, and Ecclesiastical Literature, and Ernest Martin in a book called Restoring the Bible. Now, this book, which is not easy to get a hold of anymore, the original Bible Restored, is where I first saw the importance of the manuscript order of the scriptures. And Dr. Martin, who was one of my instructors, and Dr. James Tabor, who some of you are familiar with, may be familiar with what they did in their work. So I highly recommend that you follow that. But as you look at this, you will see that in Dr. Martin's chart here, that he has what he calls the Old Testament, or the books of the Tanakh, the Torah, the law, the writings, or the prophets, and the writings. Then he has what he refers to as the Pentateuch, or the Big Five. Just like you have the Big Five of the Tanakh, you have the Torah books, the first 5 books of the Bible. The same thing with the first 5 books of what we call the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Then we have the Epistles, which in the ancient canon, it began with James, and then it went to Peter, and then it went to John, and then it went to Paul's epistles, and then finally Revelation. So I'm going to put that chart up there for just a few seconds for you to look at. You might not be able to see it very well on the video, but I think if you Google Ernest L. Martin, you could probably find his work on the internet if you're interested in getting more information. So I highly recommend his book, his work, and the work of Dr. Tabor back in the 90s. Really got my attention in terms of the order of the books. The priority or the authority of the order are, first of all, instruction, law, Torah, and then the prophets, and then the writings, the poetry and the wisdom, and then the Gospels about the Master's life, his teaching, and his authority, and then the book of Acts, which are about the early disciples' empowerment, and then the books of the 3 pillars that are mentioned in Galatians, James, Peter, and John, and then the letters, which give expanded and practical guidance, and then the apocalyptic book, Revelation, which gives the hope of overcoming in the midst of incredible obstacles in the future. So, to look at Paul's epistles in particular, the reason why they're in the order that they're in, most of you probably are not aware of this, but it has to do with an ancient bookbinding practice that allowed works to be gathered and bound together in codex or book form by the length of each section rather than the date or substance. Now, I have a whole article on this on the Aramaic Bible Perspective website, which deals with the New Testament chronology and historical background with the reading order of Paul's epistles. I'll just briefly give you that order. The oldest book that you should read after the Gospels, Acts, James, Peter, and John, to build a foundation, are the books of Galatians, and then 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, then 1st and 2nd Corinthians, then Romans, then the Gospel of Luke, then I'm reading these in the chronological order, then 1 Timothy, then Titus, and I think that concludes the books of Paul, or the ones that are attributed to Paul, because there's much debate as to which ones Paul actually wrote. If you read these books in their manuscript order, you will build a foundation. You'll build, first of all, on the actual works of the teacher himself, his works, and his teachings to his disciples, that is, Jesus, working directly with his disciples. It's important to get that foundation down first, with an understanding that he did not come to replace Torah. You know, I've been in Bible studies with Christians where they talk about Pharisees, and Pharisees are only about law and all that kind of stuff. That's not true. And not all the Pharisees were evil or bad. On the other hand, I've been in conversations with Orthodox rabbis where their official position, by the way, is that there's nothing of any value in the New Testament or in the teachings of Jesus or in Christianity at all. So they forbid their people to even read the New Testament. They think it should be burned or destroyed. Well, that's a pretty radical perspective, and I totally disagree with it. And I find much of value in the books that we call the New Testament. I spoke with a very well-known, internationally well-known Orthodox rabbi recently, and I mentioned the Sermon on the Mount, and he really poo-pooed the Sermon on the Mount. And he used as an example the teaching of Jesus that to look with a woman with lust in your heart is committing adultery in your heart. And it's as if he didn't really understand what Jesus was trying to say. It's not literally adultery. It's not the type of adultery that you could litigate on, that this person committed adultery because he had lust in his mind or in his heart. But it's the seed of adultery. And if David would have followed that admonition, he might have never sinned with Bathsheba and murdered her husband Uriah. So we have tremendous misunderstanding. And the manuscript order is very important. If you go from the Gospels to the book of Acts, you'll see the life of Jesus and his teachings, and then the empowerment of his early followers. Then you go to the book of James, you'll see the laws and the balance between faith and works. There's no problem, there's no conflict between faith and works. Faith without works is dead. And there's no conflict between law and grace. They go together. These kind of things come up because people do not build the foundation. Then from there you go into Peter's writing, which is about hope. So James tells us how to operate in faith. Peter tells us how to have hope. And back then they were in a Roman Empire that had literally torn apart and destroyed Jerusalem and occupied all of Judea. And then finally, so these are very, very important